In the remote recesses of Raven's Hollow, tucked within the jagged limestone ridges of the Cumberland Plateau, three brothers committed an act so grotesque it would haunt their lineage for generations. In 1895, Ambrose, Thaddeus, and Silas Hawthorne entered into the Covenant of Silence, a series of unions with their own sister, mother, and aunt, a decision born of conviction and madness. For 25 years, their secret festered in isolation, snow and stone shielding their sins from the outside world. But in the autumn of 1918, when 16-year-old Lillian Hawthorne finally escaped, her trembling words drew Sheriff Gideon Marlow into a nightmare that would test the boundaries of law, faith, and humanity. What creed could justify such perversion of kinship? What horrors lay buried beneath the homestead? And what remnants still linger, restless, in Raven's Hollow? Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in 1895 were a realm apart, a place where time itself seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. The Cumberland Plateau rose in successive ridges, each valley narrower, each hollow darker than the last. Entire families could vanish into these hills and remain hidden for decades. Winter brought 6-foot drifts of snow, rendering roads impassable and communication with the outside world impossible. Life here moved by unchanging rhythms, planting, harvesting, hunting, and the rare, arduous trip to a distant settlement for supplies. The hollow's isolation bred self-sufficiency and, for some, a peculiar stubbornness that edged toward fanaticism. Raven's Hollow was one such place, a geological amphitheater enclosed by cliffs nearly 300 feet high, accessible only through a narrow, treacherous pass. A stream ran through its center, fed by springs that never froze, winding through the dense undergrowth. Sunlight touched the valley floor only in fragments at high noon, leaving much of the hollow in perpetual shadow. Hunters avoided it, speaking of animals that wandered in and never returned. The few who dared enter spoke of a silence so profound that it seemed the valley itself devoured sound. It was here, amidst this natural fortress, that Ezekiel Hawthorne, a defrocked and fanatical preacher, claimed land in the 1870s. Expelled for doctrines too extreme even for frontier congregations, he preached that the world beyond the cliffs was irredeemably corrupt, that commerce and mingling of bloodlines were sins against God. His family, he insisted, were a chosen seed, pure and inviolate. In the hollow's isolation, with no neighbors and no authorities to challenge him, Ezekiel's doctrine grew rigid and cruel. When he died, he left a legacy of fear and control that would dominate his descendants. His son, Bartholomew Hawthorne, married his cousin and raised his children according to Ezekiel's uncompromising creed. When Bartholomew's wife bore him triplets in 1878, Ambrose, Thaddeus, and Silas, he proclaimed them blessed by God, a sign that the family's bloodline must remain untouched by outsiders. The brothers' lives were constrained entirely within the hollow. They never attended school, never visited a town, never spoke with anyone beyond their immediate family. Their education consisted of Ezekiel's teachings and the unforgiving lessons of survival in a wilderness that tolerated no weakness. By the time they reached manhood, the triplets were formidable figures, tall, silent, and watchful. Their lives were shaped entirely by the narrow boundaries of the hollow, their bodies honed by labor and endurance, their minds conditioned by fear and doctrine. When their father died in 1894, the brothers inherited not just the land, but the sacred duty Ezekiel had instilled. The outside world was poison, progress a corrupting force, and preservation of the bloodline their divine obligation. Their faith was absolute, their morality defined by the strictures of a patriarch long dead. In October 1918, when Sheriff Gideon Marlow first saw Lillian Hawthorne, he understood at once that something was profoundly wrong. She had been discovered by a hunter, Amos Whitaker, shivering and emaciated, barely clothed for the season. Her eyes, sunken and wide with fear, betrayed the horrors she had endured. Her collarbones jutted sharply beneath the tattered fabric of her dress, her limbs thin and fragile from years of neglect. Whitaker brought her immediately to the sheriff's office in the county seat, a small town of no more than 800 souls, the nominal center of law and order for thousands of square miles of rugged wilderness. Marlow was a veteran lawman in his late 50s, a former soldier hardened by conflict in distant wars. He had seen death and cruelty before, yet the sight of Lillian stirred something deeper than duty, a mixture of horror, pity, and urgent responsibility. Lillian's first words were fragmented, incoherent, a tangle of relationships and events that defied comprehension. She spoke of brothers and mothers, of children left to die in the dirt, of men who were one and the same, of laws older than the mountains themselves. Marlow listened patiently, recording every word, suppressing the instinct to question her sanity. Though he had dealt with isolated mountain families before, none presented the scale of horror implied in her account. She described Raven's Hollow as though it were a place apart, where ordinary rules did not apply, a valley governed by fear and devotion intertwined. The girl had attempted escape multiple times before finally succeeding, and she spoke of the valley with a terror that was palpable, as though the land itself conspired to trap its inhabitants. Marlow summoned Dr. Alistair Caldwell, the county's sole formally trained physician, a stern man in his 60s, whose practice was often at odds with local superstition. Caldwell's examination revealed severe malnutrition, evidence of prolonged abuse, stunted development from hard labor, and dental decay from years of neglect. Lillian had lived a life of extraordinary hardship, and her testimony, though confused, demanded attention. The implications were terrifying. To take her words seriously was to step into territory even the experienced sheriff found repulsive. The Hawthornes were legendary, a family so reclusive that most locals believed them to be little more than ghosts, their customs and presence whispered about rather than confronted. Those who had glimpsed them described silent, imposing figures who rarely ventured beyond the hollow, trading furs and herbs for necessities, but never speaking more than required. Interference, locals claimed, brought nothing but misfortune. Yet Lillian's account, corroborated by Caldwell's clinical findings, compelled Marlow to act. He needed men to accompany him, but few volunteered. The mountains were treacherous, the Hawthornes were rumored heavily armed, and a cultural reluctance to interfere in family matters held sway over even the bravest. In the end, Marlow gathered 3 deputies, young men who trusted his judgment more than they feared legend or superstition. Early one October morning, with the leaves turning gold and crimson, the small party set out, guided only by fragmentary directions and instinct. The journey through dense laurel, across cold streams, and over ridges that seemed to fold back upon themselves took the better part of a day. Sunlight was fleeting, filtering through the canopy in scattered pale fragments. The forest grew thicker as they approached the narrow pass that led into Raven's Hollow. The entrance appeared suddenly, a cleft between cliffs just wide enough for 2 men abreast. The deputies instinctively checked their sidearms. Beyond the pass, the hollow opened into a hidden world, a bowl of shadowed cliffs and dense forest. Silence pressed against them, broken only by footsteps and the distant cry of a crow. At the far end stood the Hawthorne Homestead, rough log structures chinked with mud and moss, the main cabin larger than Marlow expected, 2 stories with a stone chimney from which no smoke rose despite the autumn chill. Smaller outbuildings clustered nearby, their purpose obscure. From the porch emerged 3 men, identical in build and bearing, silent and watchful. Behind them appeared a gray-haired woman, her eyes hard as flint, her presence radiating authority and cold indifference. Marlow identified himself and his purpose. The men said nothing. The woman, Marjorie Hawthorne, spoke in a voice rough from disuse but clear. The law had no place here. The girl who had run away was disobedient, touched in the head, and shamed the family. When Marlow insisted on seeing other members of the household, Marjorie's expression stiffened. Only she and her sons resided here, she claimed, living in accordance with the patriarch's law, accountable to no one. But the sheriff had learned decades of law enforcement did not bend to overt denial when danger or injustice lurked. He ordered a search. Inside, the cabin was dim, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and an undefinable organic rot. The main room contained a rough table, a few chairs, and a loft accessed by a ladder. Children peered briefly from the shadows of the loft before disappearing, their eyes wide and fearful. Outbuildings offered the illusion of normalcy, smokehouse, barn, root cellar, but revealed nothing incriminating at first glance. Yet a keen eye would notice the floor near the back wall scrubbed to near white, in stark contrast with the surrounding neglect. The deputies found no weapons beyond those of a mountain family. The sense of something deeply wrong persisted. As twilight approached, a deputy noticed a faint path leading from the rear of the cabin into thick laurel, nearly invisible except for an absence of undergrowth. Marlow followed it with his men. The forest opened into a small clearing, revealing a second decrepit cabin. Smoke rose from a crude chimney. Movement was visible within. A woman's thin voice asked if they were from outside the hollow. When confirmed, the door opened. Inside stood two women, malnourished, their clothing little more than rags, their faces marked by hardship and despair. Children, at various ages, peered from shadows, some bearing deformities indicative of generations of inbreeding. The air reeked of human waste and illness. The older woman, Prudence Hawthorne, spoke rapidly, tears streaming. She and the younger woman, Celia, were kept confined, married within the family according to sacred law, forbidden from approaching the main cabin except when summoned. The children were their offspring, some born only to die shortly after, buried somewhere on the property. The scope of the horror pressed down upon Marlow, a tangible weight he could not dismiss. The law and morality collided here, within the silent cliffs of Raven's Hollow. Outside, shadows lengthened across the homestead, the forest waiting silently beyond, as if bearing witness to a secret older than memory. Sheriff Gideon Marlow stood frozen for a moment, the weight of what he had seen pressing against the edges of his reason. He had confronted cruelty before, but the breadth of depravity in Raven's Hollow defied comprehension. Prudence Hawthorne's trembling confession, combined with Lillian's harrowing escape, painted a picture of systematic cruelty, sanctioned by a doctrine older than the Hollow itself. The children were pale, skeletal in places, their eyes wide and vacant, yet alive with a terror learned from years of confinement. Marlow's deputies moved cautiously, their hands never far from their revolvers, scanning the shadows of the cabin where the children lingered. Every movement seemed magnified in the suffocating quiet, the stillness pressing against their ears with the oppressive weight of anticipation. Dr. Alistair Caldwell, summoned earlier to examine Lillian, now approached the SEC. On cabin, his steps measured. The air around the structure was pungent, a mix of human waste, damp wood, and something else that suggested long-neglected illness. He had brought with him rudimentary tools for assessment, stethoscope, tongue depressors, and a small kit for minor procedures. But here, in the suffocating, dimly lit interior, nothing felt adequate. The first glimpse of the children and their emaciated mothers halted him. He adjusted his spectacles and muttered under his breath, noting the pallor, the visible deformities, the signs of neglect and malnutrition. These were not merely signs of poverty, they bore the marks of isolation, of generations cultivated in secrecy, where illness, malformation, and mental disturbance had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Caldwell's trained mind catalogued every observation clinically, yet the enormity of human suffering present in this single clearing made his usual detachment difficult to maintain. Prudence spoke quickly, her words spilling in a torrent that seemed almost rehearsed, though born of terror. She described the rituals of the household, the sacred unions sanctioned by Marjorie and her sons, the manner in which children were born and hidden, the deaths that followed silently and unremarked. Celia, younger and quieter, nodded in confirmation, her voice fragile but coherent. She spoke of her own children, some taken by sickness, others deliberately denied sustenance or care, and of the pervasive doctrine that had governed every choice, every action, every birth. Their words were a confession, a plea, and a warning, yet they were delivered in such a calm, factual tone that it made the horror seem all the more real. The lawmen recorded everything meticulously, their pens scratching across paper as though the act of writing could anchor them to reality in the face of so much inhumanity. Outside, Ambrose, Thaddeus, and Silas Hawthorne remained on the porch of the main cabin, statuesque and silent, their eyes fixed on the intruders. Marjorie, the matriarch, remained unmoved, her arms crossed, a figure of authority and absolute control. Marlow had long suspected that a family such as this would resist, but the stillness, the cold certainty in their gazes, was far more unsettling than any active threat. Each brother bore the same flat, watchful expression, their bodies imposing yet restrained. When Marlow demanded answers regarding the graves of the deceased children, Prudence hesitated, glancing back toward the main cabin, as though even now she feared retribution. Then she indicated a patch of earth behind the dilapidated cabin. Small mounds, barely visible beneath encroaching weeds, revealed the truth without ceremony. Marlow approached and knelt, digging carefully with his gloved hands. Within minutes, he uncovered the fragile bones of an infant, wrapped in rotted cloth, buried scarcely 2 feet beneath the surface. The reality of systematic concealment struck him harder than words ever could. This was not sporadic neglect. This was an entire system built to hide the consequences of a family doctrine that valued blood purity above life itself. Caldwell examined the remains briefly, confirming malnutrition and the faint outlines of deformities consistent with generational inbreeding. Each new detail reinforced the growing sense of horror that seemed to cling to the valley like mist. The deputies moved the women and children to a makeshift area cleared at the edge of the hollow. Each step was careful, measured, as if any sudden motion might trigger retaliation. Despite the trauma etched on every face, there was a subdued obedience in the children, a learned compliance born of years under strict control. Some of the younger children stared at the lawmen without understanding, their features marred by developmental irregularities that were unmistakable. The air was thick with tension, each breath carrying the scent of decay, of unwashed bodies, and of fear. Marlow's mind worked in parallel. He had to secure evidence, protect the victims, and confront the adults who had orchestrated these atrocities, all while navigating a moral terrain so twisted it defied precedent. Marjorie finally spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, and chilling in its certainty. "You see only what you choose to see," she said, her gaze sweeping the assembled officers and deputies. "We have done no crime in the eyes of God. We obey the laws of our patriarch. Blood must remain untainted. These children are ours. They belong to our family as they always have." Ambrose, Thaddeus, and Silas nodded in unison, a synchronized gesture that amplified the eerie impression of rehearsed devotion. The lawmen exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the impossibility of reasoning with individuals whose moral compass was defined entirely by a doctrine removed from worldly law. Marlow, sensing the limit of his authority but determined to act, ordered the immediate removal of Prudence, Celia, and the children to the county seat. Each movement was fraught with difficulty. The children were wary, many instinctively retreating into shadows or clinging to the women. Even the older ones, those on the cusp of adolescence, exhibited the same learned submission and fear. Caldwell administered rudimentary care where necessary, checking for injuries, tending to sores, and assessing mental state. Lillian, still trembling but more composed, offered guidance to the younger ones, pointing out paths, providing small comforts, whispering encouragement in tones she had rarely used outside the presence of her tormentors. Her survival instincts, honed by years of abuse and isolation, had transformed her into a quiet, competent leader despite her youth. As preparations continued, Marlow turned his attention back to the main cabin. The brothers remained unmoving, silent witnesses to the extraction of their victims. Marjorie's eyes never wavered from him, cold and unyielding. He attempted to question them directly about the other missing children, the small graves, and the full scope of their actions. Ambrose responded first, his tone flat but precise. "We answer only to the patriarch's law. All that has occurred is within the will of God. We protect our bloodline. Nothing else matters." Thaddeus and Silas mirrored him, their voices indistinguishable, the effect almost disorienting. Marlow felt the weight of futility pressing upon him. No argument, no legal threat, no appeal to reason could penetrate the wall of belief that defined these men. The deputies began cataloging the scene, the scrubbed floors of the main cabin, the meticulously maintained areas contrasted with the neglect of other sections, and the arrangement of children in the loft. Each observation painted a picture of deliberate control, of ritualized enforcement of a doctrine that subordinated life itself to abstract notions of purity and obedience. Even the outbuildings, at first seemingly innocuous, contributed evidence. The smokehouse, the root cellar, and the barn, all carefully managed to support a self-sufficient existence, yet isolated from oversight, ensuring the family's secrets remained hidden. By nightfall, The extraction was complete. Prudence, Celia, and the children were loaded onto wagons, guarded and supervised, their faces pale in the lantern light. Marlow surveyed the hollow one last time before turning toward the trail that led out, the cliffs looming like silent witnesses. The brothers remained on the porch, statuesque and unwavering, their expressions reflecting not fear but a profound certainty, a belief in the righteousness of their actions that defied the sheriff's understanding. Marjorie followed them only with her gaze, her body motionless, her authority absolute. Even in their absence, it felt as though the valley itself had been claimed by the Hawthornes, their presence imprinted indelibly upon its stones and streams. As they descended the narrow pass, the sheriff and his men were quiet, each processing the day's events in solitude. Marlow's mind replayed Lillian's testimony, Prudence and Celia's confessions, and the evidence he had seen with meticulous attention. The scale of the family's isolation, combined with their strict adherence to an internalized and brutal doctrine, created a reality nearly impossible to reconcile with common law or human ethics. He thought of the generations hidden in the hollow, the children who had never seen the world beyond its cliffs, the bodies buried in unmarked graves, and the chilling certainty with which the adults had defended their actions. Every detail reinforced the grim reality. The Hawthornes were not merely eccentric, they were a self-contained, functioning system of cruelty, a living echo of Ezekiel's doctrine, maintained with fanatical devotion. At the county seat, the victims were taken into care under strict supervision. Caldwell continued medical assessments, identifying developmental delays, untreated illnesses, and psychological trauma. Lillian, despite her youth, assumed a leadership role among the rescued children, guiding them with a quiet authority born of necessity. The sheriff and his deputies documented each discovery meticulously, their reports intended to build a case strong enough to withstand any legal scrutiny. Yet, even with the evidence gathered and the victims removed, a lingering unease remained. The hollow itself seemed untouched, its shadows unchanged, its silence undisturbed. Marlow knew that in some way, the valley had claimed him as well, embedding itself in his thoughts, in his memory, and in the sense of foreboding that would not fade. Raven's Hollow had revealed its horrors, but its full depth, its secrets and rituals, were far from exhausted. The events of that day would haunt the sheriff and his deputies, shaping their understanding of human depravity and the lengths to which belief could bend morality. The following morning, Sheriff Gideon Marlow returned to the county seat with Dr. Caldwell and the rescued women and children. The small infirmary, a brick building with narrow windows and walls lined with fading plaster, became the temporary sanctuary for the victims. Lillian Hawthorne sat on a worn wooden bench, her knees pulled close to her chest as Caldwell methodically examined the younger children. Their pallor was alarming, some were barely able to stand, and most bore subtle, disturbing physical deformities, flattened foreheads, misaligned jaws, and spindly limbs, silent evidence of generations of inbreeding and deprivation. Caldwell took notes with grim diligence, aware that his report would be central to the prosecution, but also deeply disturbed by the ethical weight of what he observed. Each child was a record of cruelty meticulously maintained over decades, a living testament to the Hawthornes' obsessive doctrine. Lillian's voice, though soft, was steady as she recounted her escape and the events leading up to it. The sheriff and the doctor listened intently, his pen scratching across paper, Caldwell occasionally pausing to record medical observations. She spoke of the schedule imposed by the brothers, of the punishments meted out for disobedience, and of the strict hierarchy enforced by Marjorie, who presided over the family with an authority that had suppressed rebellion for decades. She described the marriages within the family, ceremonies conducted in secrecy, the cycle of birth and death controlled with clinical precision. Her words painted a picture of a household where fear was codified, where obedience was law, and where the line between protection and exploitation had been obliterated. Dr. Caldwell, though trained in reason, found himself momentarily unable to detach. He leaned closer to Lillian, noting her thin frame, the bruise marks along her arms, the tremor in her hands. "You survived because you were careful," he murmured, attempting reassurance. She nodded, but her eyes wide and deep. arc revealed the persistent terror that had lodged in her mind. Even here, in the light of a civilized town, she could not shake the shadow of Raven's Hollow nor the knowledge of what her family had done. Marlow spent the morning questioning the women, Prudence and Celia, separately, attempting to map the scale of the family's transgressions. Prudence, older and more resilient, answered with cautious precision. She spoke of the children kept hidden in the secondary cabin, their confinement strict and ritualized. She admitted to being married to her nephew Silas, the eldest brother, while Celia had been wed to Ambrose, and the youngest brother, Thaddeus, had taken Marjorie, his own mother, as his partner. Prudence's voice wavered when describing the infants who had perished, small bodies buried in unmarked graves scattered across the hollow. Her tone, though tremulous, was matter-of-fact, as if she were reporting agricultural yields rather than lives extinguished. Celia, younger, was quieter, but equally precise. Her memory traced the daily routines, the chores, the punishments, the controlled rations, the ceremonies where her children were formally integrated into the family lineage. She described the secrecy with an almost clinical detachment. They had lived as if the hollow itself were a world apart, a place where outsiders could not intrude, a sanctuary for a bloodline preserved according to divine mandate. Both women, despite years of captivity and abuse, conveyed a sense of loyalty, however fractured, to the ideology that had imprisoned them. The sheriff and the doctor worked to corroborate the testimony with physical evidence. The infirmary yard became a temporary examination space, Caldwell measuring children's limbs, testing reflexes, and noting the telltale signs of developmental malnutrition: hair thin and brittle, skin sallow, joints misshapen, and faces drawn and angular. Even as he catalogued these injuries, he could not ignore the psychological effects. Some children recoiled from sudden movements, others avoided eye contact entirely. Lillian, serving as an intermediary, attempted to soothe the younger ones, whispering guidance and instruction, her own hands trembling as she did so. Caldwell observed that the trauma extended beyond the body. The children's expressions, posture, and hesitancy spoke of fear as a persistent, formative force. Meanwhile, Marlow began the painstaking process of reconstructing the hollow's layout. He used maps, testimonies, and rudimentary sketches provided by the women to mark the main cabin, the secondary cabin, the small outbuildings, and the burial sites of the children. The sheriff recognized a disturbing pattern. The entire property was designed not merely for habitation but for control. Living quarters were intentionally segregated, sightlines controlled, and movement restricted. Each cabin and path was a deliberate structure of dominance, each arrangement an exercise of absolute authority over those trapped within. It was not simply neglect, it was a methodical design, a household engineered to enforce obedience and perpetuate a doctrine of isolation and purity. Caldwell, observing the children, made meticulous notes about potential long-term effects. Malformations suggested consanguinity, while signs of chronic hunger and physical abuse were clear. He noted that even if the children were removed from the hollow immediately, their growth, both physical and psychological, would likely be permanently impaired. They bore the imprint of generational trauma, a living archive of the Hawthorne's philosophy enacted in flesh and bone. The sheriff, taking in these details, understood that the trial would require both legal rigor and careful narrative construction, proof of the familial structure, the acts committed, and the doctrine that justified them all. In the evenings, the women were allowed rest under guard, though sleep was fitful. Shadows in the corners of the infirmary suggested memories that would not release them so easily. Lillian, despite exhaustion, stayed vigilant, ensuring the younger children remained calm, guiding them through simple routines, and quietly teaching them the patterns of a world outside Raven's Hollow. Her knowledge of the Hollow's rituals allowed her to anticipate fear triggers and mitigate panic. In this capacity, she became a bridge between the law and the traumatized family members, a young guardian who carried both fear and authority. As the days progressed, Marlow convened a meeting with local authorities to plan the next steps. The magnitude of the case was daunting. Evidence had to be secured at the Hollow, testimonies recorded with precision, and the possibility of resistance from the remaining adults anticipated. It was clear that Ambrose, Thaddeus, and Silas would not willingly submit to arrest or explanation. Their worldview rendered the law irrelevant. Marlow also had to consider the secondary cabin, where more children and possibly other women remained confined. Even the simplest decisions carried risk, for these were men shaped entirely by isolation, by doctrine, and by the belief that their actions were divinely mandated. A few days later, under careful preparation, Marlow and a small contingent of deputies returned to Raven's Hollow, guided by Prudence and Celia. The hollow greeted them with an eerie calm, its cliffs silent witnesses to the family's twisted domain. The main cabin, now seen from a different perspective, revealed subtle signs of preparation, as if the Hawthornes anticipated return. Marlow noticed the scrubbed floors, the orderly exterior, the absence of obvious signs of life beyond the controlled areas. Still, the second cabin lay hidden in the thicket, smoke curling from its chimney, suggesting inhabitants remained. Each step into the hollow was heavy with tension, the dense undergrowth, the silent cliffs, and the faint trail to the secondary cabin, all contributed to a sense of being watched, evaluated, judged. Upon reaching the second cabin, the lawmen observed the trapped figures inside. Caldwell prepared to conduct immediate health assessments, while Marlow called out formally, declaring the authority of the law and demanding the release of any remaining women and children. The figures inside, though malnourished and wary, recognized the sheriff's presence. Prudence and Celia moved to usher the children forward, attempting to calm their fear. Caldwell entered with measured caution, his medical eye scanning for acute injury and malformation, while Marlow maintained vigilance outside, ensuring the brothers could not interfere. The process of removal was meticulous. Children were handed into care, women assisted, and all observed for signs of resistance or distress. Marlow noted subtle but telling details. Some children instinctively crouched, ready to flee or hide. Others clung tightly to one another, seeking comfort in the only security they knew. Caldwell noted that beyond immediate physical care, long-term recovery would require patience, therapy, and protection from the psychological imprint of their upbringing. Every individual carried the marks of doctrine and fear, a lifetime of obedience enforced by rigid and brutal authority. By late afternoon, the hollow was nearly empty, save for the main cabin where Marjorie and the brothers remained. Their presence was a silent assertion. Even in the absence of victims, the domain was theirs, governed by ideology and fear, unbroken by the sheriff's authority. Marlow understood then that the confrontation to come would test more than law. It would challenge the very conception of morality, belief, and obedience. The hollow was a microcosm of deliberate cruelty, a family that had institutionalized horror, and now it remained to be determined whether justice could navigate such a landscape. As the party departed the hollow, carrying the victims to the waiting wagons, a shadow lingered. Even with the children and women secured, the valley retained an aura of control, a quiet menace. The cliffs seemed to echo with the absent voices of the lost, the unspeakable rituals of the past, and the doctrine that had imprisoned life itself. Marlow's mind was heavy with thought. Evidence had been gathered, victims removed, but the story of Raven's Hollow was far from complete. The full scale of the family's actions, the extent of their doctrine, and the consequences for generations yet unborn were threads he had only begun to trace. Marlow and Caldwell returned to the county seat with the rescued victims, their minds haunted by what they had witnessed. Each night, the sheriff recorded observations, structured testimonies, and catalogued evidence, aware that the trial would demand precision, clarity, and patience. He reviewed maps of the hollow, noting the placements of cabins, paths, and burial sites. Caldwell prepared medical reports detailing the physiological and psychological damage inflicted by years of confinement, neglect, and forced unions. Lillian, despite exhaustion, helped organize the children, teaching them to walk, eat, and interact in ways foreign to their upbringing. Evening after evening, the shadows of Raven's Hollow stretched long across the minds of those who had confronted it. The horror of the Hawthorne's doctrine, the meticulous cruelty, and the scale of generational trauma loomed over every decision. And yet, despite the rescue and the removal of victims, the hollow itself seemed untouched, as though the stones, cliffs, and trees retained memory, a silent archive of every act, every transgression, and every oath sworn in darkness. The trial preparations occupied Sheriff Gideon Marlow and Dr. Alistair Caldwell for several weeks. They worked tirelessly, reviewing every testimony, mapping the hollow in painstaking detail, and compiling medical reports that would establish the physical and psychological trauma inflicted upon the children. Lillian, Prudence, and Celia were interviewed repeatedly, each session adding layers of clarity, yet also revealing the full scope of the horror. The county's courthouse, a modest brick building with high ceilings and narrow windows, soon became the stage upon which the Hawthornes' deeds would be confronted in the light of law, yet it remained far too small to contain the weight of human misery that had been drawn from Raven's Hollow. Caldwell spent hours cataloguing the children's condition, noting skeletal abnormalities, stunted growth, and the telltale features of prolonged malnutrition. Every medical observation was carefully recorded, cross-referenced with the mother's recollections. The physical deformities were undeniable: elongated limbs disproportionate to torsos, misshapen skulls, dental irregularities, and uneven muscle development, all consistent with repeated inbreeding and generational isolation. Caldwell's reports were clinical and unsparing, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Each child was a living document, proof that the doctrine enforced by Marjorie and her sons had manifested tangibly, irreversibly, in flesh and bone. Marlow, meanwhile, coordinated the collection of physical evidence from Raven's Hollow itself. Deputies returned to the hollow with spades, trowels, and lanterns, systematically uncovering unmarked graves that Prudence and Celia had indicated. Each tiny mound revealed a body, infants wrapped in rotting cloth, their fragile skeletons preserved by the cold soil and careful concealment. The number of graves surpassed even the most horrific accounts provided by the escapees, hinting at decades of silent death. Marlow recorded each location with meticulous precision, noting the orientation, depth, and apparent age of the remains. Photographs were impossible. The only record was the sheriff's sketches and written descriptions. Despite the grim task, Marlow remained steadfast, aware that legal accountability required concrete documentation. C.A. Caldwell worked alongside him, noting variations in skeletal development, evidence of untreated disease, and congenital abnormalities. "This is not merely neglect," Caldwell said quietly one evening, brushing soil from a tiny femur. "This is an engineered isolation. Every child, every body is proof of deliberate design. The doctrine dictated biology itself." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with the weight of understanding. Here was a family whose moral compass had been entirely reoriented, whose adherence to ideology had overridden every natural law, every instinct for compassion. In the courthouse, Lillian's testimony was central. She recounted the daily lives of the children and women, the rigid schedules imposed by the brothers, the punishments for disobedience, and the ceremonies that formalized marriages within the family. Her recollection was precise, though occasionally fractured by trauma. She described watching infants carried away to the hidden cabin, never to return, and seeing older children retreat silently into corners at the sight of their uncles. The court listened, rapt yet horrified, as she spoke of the hollow itself, a place that seemed alive, that enforced obedience through shadow, silence, and isolation. Prudence and Celia testified in separate sessions, their voices calm but weighted with emotion. Prudence described how she had been confined for years, married to Silas, her children taken from her for purposes she scarcely understood at the time. Celia's testimony complemented hers. She spoke of her union with Ambrose, of Thaddeus's marriage to Marjorie, and of the rituals surrounding the children's births, deaths, and concealment. The women's recollections overlapped in detail, creating a web of corroboration that made the Hawthornes' doctrine tangible, visible, undeniable. Each account added layers to the portrait of a family systematized around cruelty, obedience, and the preservation of a bloodline, a structure that had endured decades of secrecy within the isolation of the hollow. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread among the townspeople. Raven's Hollow, long regarded as a place of superstition, folklore, and hushed caution, was now a tangible site of horror. Locals spoke of the cliffs, the dense laurel, and the narrow passes as if the landscape itself had conspired with the family to maintain control. Farmers, traders, and hunters recounted tales of fleeting glimpses of the Hawthornes over the years, the brothers at distant trading posts, silent, austere, and imposing. Marjorie moving among her sons with an authority that intimidated even the boldest men. Marlow, ever conscious of public perception, noted that the stories, once dismissed as legend, now carried a chilling legitimacy. Back in the courthouse, Dr. Caldwell presented detailed medical reports to the prosecution. He explained the physiological consequences of generational inbreeding, the impact of chronic malnutrition, and the mental strain imposed by long-term isolation and fear. He spoke clinically of developmental delays, physical deformities, and psychological trauma, emphasizing that these were not anomalies, but predictable outcomes of the Hawthorne's practices. The court listened in stunned silence, the gravity of his testimony mirrored in the pallor and stillness of the jury. Marlow and the deputies organized the evidence meticulously. Maps of the hollow, sketches of cabin layouts, and records of unmarked graves were submitted. Witness testimony, medical reports, and the survivors' accounts created a comprehensive narrative that traced the systematic nature of the Hawthornes' actions. Every detail mattered: the scrubbed floors in the main cabin, the hidden paths leading to secondary structures, the isolated living conditions of the women and children, and the alignment of the brothers' actions with the ideology enforced by Marjorie. This was no ordinary case of neglect. It was premeditated, organized, and logically driven cruelty, codified across decades. Yet even as the evidence mounted, Marlow sensed an unease that could not be quantified. The hollow, its cliffs, and its trees seemed to persist as silent witnesses, holding secrets that might never fully surface. There was an intangible weight, a lingering presence, that suggested the Hawthornes' influence extended beyond physical control. Even absent from the hollow, the family's ideology had shaped the land itself, embedding fear and obedience into the rhythms of life within its walls. Marlow felt a chill each time he recalled the synchronized nods of the brothers, the cold certainty in Marjorie's gaze, and the vacant, conditioned eyes of the children. It was as if the hollow had been a crucible shaping both flesh and mind, leaving a mark that extended beyond immediate victims. The weeks of trial preparation also allowed for reflection on the broader implications. Marlow considered the isolation of the hollow, the absence of oversight, and the ability of ideology to dictate behavior across generations. He recognized patterns in human behavior, the susceptibility to belief systems that demanded obedience, and the consequences when that obedience became absolute. In Raven's Hollow, doctrine had overridden law, compassion, and natural instinct. The family had constructed a microcosm entirely removed from social norms, and within it, horror had flourished unnoticed for decades. On the eve of the trial, Marlow walked through the courthouse quietly, reviewing evidence and notes. The atmosphere was heavy, suffused with anticipation and unease. He thought of the hollow, the scrubbed floors, the secondary cabin, the mounds of graves, and the children he had seen. He knew the upcoming trial would not merely be a matter of law, it would test the ability of reason to confront fanaticism, cruelty, and belief that transcended social and moral convention. The case would challenge the community's understanding of justice, the boundaries of human endurance, and the capacity of ideology to shape and deform life itself. Late that evening, Dr. Caldwell approached Marlow, his expression grave. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "we have gathered evidence sufficient to prove the atrocities, but the true horror is not only what they have done, it is what they have believed and what they will continue to believe." Marlow nodded, understanding the depth of the warning. The Hawthorne's doctrine was more than a set of actions. It was a worldview, embedded in every gesture, every choice, every death, and every survival within the hollow. Their belief system had endured, had dictated behavior, and had inflicted harm in ways both visible and invisible. As the night deepened, the courthouse fell silent. Marlow and Caldwell reviewed their final plans, preparing for a trial that would not merely recount events, but confront a generational philosophy of cruelty. The rescued women and children were placed in secure accommodations, their care and recovery continuing under close supervision. Yet even as they slept, shadows of Raven's Hollow lingered, memories of ritualized fear and obedience that would not easily be erased. Lillian, now a reluctant guardian for the younger survivors, moved quietly among them, her presence a source of comfort and guidance. She understood the hollows of fear that had shaped them, and she worked tirelessly to replace instinctive obedience with cautious trust. The day of the trial would test more than legal skill. It would demand an engagement with the darkness that had flourished in isolation. The Hawthornes, in their silence and certainty, would stand as living monuments to a doctrine that had manipulated life and death with ruthless efficiency, and the hollow itself, distant yet ever-present, would remain a silent, enduring witness, its shadows and cliffs guarding secrets that might never fully be revealed. The trial began on a gray morning in early March 1919. The courthouse was crowded beyond its capacity, the air thick with the scent of damp wool, candle smoke, and anxious anticipation. News of Ravens Hollow had spread rapidly through the county and beyond, and townsfolk, reporters, and curious observers gathered to witness the proceedings. Sheriff Gideon Marlow and Dr. Alistair Caldwell sat together at a table near the front, their notes meticulously arranged, each detail cross-referenced, each sketch and medical report at the ready. Outside, the wind swept down from the cliffs, rattling shutters and carrying the faint spectral echo of the hollow, as if the land itself were aware of the scrutiny that awaited its inhabitants. The Hawthornes arrived under heavy guard, each brother handcuffed, their posture rigid and unyielding, their faces impassive. Marjorie entered last, her hair bound tightly, her expression carved in stone. Though physically constrained, there was an aura of authority that accompanied her movements, as if the courtroom were merely a temporary stage, and she remained sovereign within the hollow's enduring shadows. The judge, a man in his 70s with a stern jaw and eyes that betrayed both curiosity and unease, called the court to order. The air seemed to tighten as the first motions were read aloud, and a silence descended over the gathered observers, punctuated only by the shuffle of papers and the faint scratching of pen on paper as Marlow and Caldwell made final preparations. The prosecution began by establishing the genealogy and residence of the Hawthorne family, emphasizing the hollow's isolation and the decades-long absence of oversight. Witnesses were called, starting with Lillian Hawthorne. Her testimony was precise and measured, recounting the daily rituals of the family, the punishments imposed for disobedience, and the ceremonies by which the brothers married their kin. Each statement was corroborated by Prudence and Celia, who described their own confinement, the births and deaths of children, and the systematic concealment of both. Their accounts, though emotional at times, carried an unsettling clarity, a methodical presentation of decades of cruelty and ritualized control. Dr. Caldwell presented his medical findings with deliberate detachment, citing specific cases among the children: stunted growth, malformations, dental deformities, and developmental delays. He emphasized the consistency of these symptoms with long-term inbreeding and chronic malnutrition, noting that the physical and psychological damage was ongoing and irreversible. The court listened, rapt and horrified, as he described the secondary cabin and the living conditions therein: confined spaces, minimal sustenance, and constant surveillance, all designed to enforce obedience and preserve the family's bloodline. Caldwell's reports left no room for doubt. These were not anomalies or accidents of frontier life. They were intentional acts, sustained over decades. As evidence was introduced, Marlow guided jurors through maps of Ravens Hollow. The sketches depicted the main cabin, the secondary cabin, hidden paths, and the locations of graves discovered by deputies. He walked the jury through the sequence of discovery, explaining how the hidden cabins had allowed the Hawthornes to isolate women and children, and how the carefully maintained landscape had facilitated both control and concealment. Each mound of earth, each scrubbed floor, each shadowed path became a testament to planning and forethought, not mere neglect or eccentricity. The hollow itself emerged as a character in the narrative, its cliffs, thickets, and streams complicit in the family's meticulous enforcement of doctrine. The defense attempted to challenge the credibility of the witnesses, emphasizing the trauma they had endured and suggesting that memory could be unreliable under such conditions. They questioned Caldwell's findings, positing that malnutrition and physical anomalies could arise from environmental hardship rather than deliberate action. But these arguments faltered in the face of detailed medical records, corroborated testimony, and the physical evidence gathered at the hollow. Even the defense could not account for the precise alignment of the brothers' actions. the calculated design of the cabins and paths, and the chilling synchronization of obedience that had been described by multiple witnesses. In mid-afternoon, Marlow requested permission to introduce the surviving children to the court, under strict supervision. The purpose was not to sensationalize, but to provide incontrovertible evidence of the long-term effects of the Hawthornes' practices. The children were brought forward, their eyes wide with caution, their posture hesitant and uncertain. Some clung to Lillian or Prudence, seeking reassurance. Caldwell described each child's condition in detail, their height and weight compared to age norms, skeletal development, cognitive ability, and the visible effects of trauma. The visual testimony of the children, combined with Caldwell's clinical analysis, rendered abstract accusations tangible. The audience could see, in living form, the consequences of the doctrine enforced within Raven's Hollow. The prosecution then presented the accounts of unmarked graves. Marlow described the methodical discovery of infant remains, buried in shallow mounds behind the secondary cabin. Sketches detailed the layout, showing how the graves were concealed and how the ground had been deliberately disturbed to avoid detection. Prudence and Celia described the deaths as a consequence of the family's ideology. Infants were sometimes removed because their existence threatened the preservation of the bloodline, or because they had been born with deformities. Each grave represented both an individual life extinguished and a physical manifestation of doctrine. Caldwell testified that even the soil's cold and density had failed to hide the telltale signs of trauma, indicating careful yet merciless intent. During cross-examination, the defense attempted to portray the Hawthornes as products of isolation, constrained by geography and culture rather than intent. They argued that the family's actions were misguided attempts at protection rather than deliberate cruelty. Marlow, anticipating this line of reasoning, guided jurors back to the evidence: the hidden cabins, the scrubbed floors, the synchronization of obedience, and the repeated patterns of intermarriage. He emphasized the deliberate structuring of the hollow itself to facilitate control. The evidence painted the Hawthornes not as mere victims of circumstance, but as architects of a system designed to enforce doctrine at the cost of life, health, and innocence. Caldwell's testimony grew more detailed as he described the physical development of the children in relation to their confinement. He noted that several of the older children exhibited signs of arrested growth, muscular atrophy, and cognitive delay consistent with chronic deprivation. The environment, he explained, was not merely harsh, it was calculated. Each restriction, each punishment, each ritualized act of control contributed to developmental impairment. The doctrine dictated biology, and the family enforced it with unwavering precision. His voice carried across the room, clinical yet charged with a sense of moral urgency. The jury listened, captivated and horrified, as he outlined the relationship between ideology and observable physical effect. Outside the courtroom, whispers and speculation ran rampant. Townspeople discussed Raven's Hollow in low tones, recounting the discovery of graves, the hidden cabins, and the unnatural synchronization of the brothers' behavior. Reporters sent telegrams to regional papers, their dispatches sensational yet grounded in verified testimony. The Hollow, once a shadowed legend, had become a tangible locus of fear, a site where human doctrine and cruelty had intertwined with geography to create a microcosm of horror. Even as the trial progressed, Marlow remained acutely aware that not all horrors could be measured or documented. The Hollow had been a crucible, shaping minds as well as bodies. The doctrine that had guided the Hawthornes' actions remained intact, a persistent ideological presence that could not be removed by testimony alone. He understood that the trial would address crimes, but the deeper influence, the way fear, obedience, and belief had been institutionalized over generations, was a force beyond immediate control. The Hollow itself retained memory, and the cliffs and laurel thickets seemed to carry a residual authority, a quiet reminder of the family's enduring influence. As the day concluded, the defense requested a recess, and the court adjourned until the following morning. Marlow and Caldwell remained behind, reviewing notes, sketches, and testimony. They spoke quietly of the children, of the hidden cabins, and of the unmarked graves, aware that each detail formed part of a larger narrative of generational cruelty. Caldwell remarked that the physiological evidence alone was sufficient to establish intent, yet Marlow emphasized that the case's power lay in the intersection of law, ideology, and geography. Raven's Hollow had allowed doctrine to manifest in flesh and soil. The law would now attempt to confront the consequences. That evening, as Marlow walked to the county jail where the Hawthornes were held, he paused at the edge of a ridge overlooking the surrounding forest. Though miles from the hollow itself, the cliffs and thickets seemed to press inward, echoing with the memory of ritual, punishment, and obedience. He felt a cold awareness that the hollow's influence was not limited to its physical confines. Even removed from Raven's Hollow, the ideology remained, carried in the survivors, the siblings, and the bones that had lain beneath the soil for decades. The sheriff understood that while justice could prosecute acts, it could not so easily eradicate belief. Inside the jail, Marjorie and her sons sat silently, their faces unreadable. They had been informed of the evidence against them, the graves, the testimony, the medical findings. Yet their composure remained intact. Marlow observed them closely, noting that their ideology had not been shaken. The Hollow's doctrine, reinforced over decades of isolation, had become indistinguishable from their identity. They understood the charges but interpreted them through the lens of obedience, duty, and divine mandate. In their eyes was a clarity that was chilling in its detachment. As night fell, the sheriff reviewed the plan for the following day. Witnesses were scheduled, medical experts prepared, and maps displayed. Every piece of evidence had been catalogued, yet Marlow could not shake the sense that the Hollow itself watched from afar, a silent participant in the proceedings. The shadows it cast, both physical and ideological, lingered in the minds of all who had entered, and in that quiet reflection, he realized that the trial, no matter its outcome, was only the beginning. Raven's Hollow had endured, and its legacy would echo long after the gavel fell. The courtroom reconvened the following morning, sunlight filtering weakly through the tall, narrow windows, casting long, austere shadows across the wooden floor. Sheriff Gideon Marlow and Dr. Alistair Caldwell arrived early, reviewing the day's proceedings with meticulous care. The evidence from Raven's Hollow had been thoroughly presented, yet the prosecution understood that the case required not only proof of action but also the demonstration of intentionality, the doctrinal rigor that had governed the Hawthornes' behavior for decades. The Hollow had not merely isolated bodies, it had isolated belief, and that belief had dictated each act. Dr. Caldwell was called first, presenting in greater depth the medical and psychological ramifications of generational isolation and inbreeding. He began with a comprehensive account of the children, drawing upon his weeks of observation, measurements, and assessments. He described, clinically and dispassionately, the features of developmental trauma, misshapen skulls, elongated limbs, irregular dentition, and muscular atrophy. Each observation was contextualized within the framework of prolonged deprivation and isolation, emphasizing that these were not mere accidents of frontier living, but direct consequences of structured environmental control. This, Caldwell explained, gesturing toward the sketches of the secondary cabin, is not merely neglect, this is design. Every restriction, every hidden corridor, every enforced separation has contributed to predictable physiological outcomes. The doctrine followed by the Hawthornes dictated biology itself. In effect, ideology became a form of governance over life and death. His voice carried the weight of years of scholarship, and the courtroom was silent, absorbing the stark implications of his findings. The jury leaned forward, aware that they were not merely judging acts, but a system, a deliberate orchestration of human suffering across decades. Next, the prosecution introduced the detailed sketches of the Hollow, comparing the spatial layout to the accounts provided by Lillian, Prudence, and Celia. Marlow guided the jury through the main cabin, the secondary cabin, and the hidden paths that linked them. The maps depicted scrubbed floors, concealed chambers, and the network of routes that allowed the Hawthornes to monitor and control movement within the Hollow. He emphasized that these paths and structures were not incidental. They had been maintained, adjusted, and enforced over decades to perpetuate the family's doctrine. Each cabin, each hidden passage, each cleared or scrubbed area represented intentional action, part of a comprehensive system of control. The prosecution then called the women and children, again under strict supervision. Lillian, Prudence, and Celia recounted in detail the day-to-day operations of the Hollow, the rituals surrounding the births and deaths of children, and the ceremonies that formalized intermarriage among kin. Their voices were measured but heavy with emotional gravity, conveying both the fear and the understanding that had been instilled over decades. Each narrative reinforced Caldwell's medical testimony, illustrating that the physical evidence was inseparable from the ideological enforcement that governed behavior. The children, though quiet and wary, stood as living witnesses to the consequences of isolation and doctrine. The defense attempted to frame the Hawthornes as victims of circumstance, constrained by geography and local tradition, rather than by deliberate design. They argued that isolation, remoteness, and the harshness of frontier life were sufficient explanations for malnutrition, delayed growth, and developmental anomalies. Marlow countered this argument through meticulous presentation of evidence: the scrubbed floors in the main cabin, the hidden paths to secondary structures, the systematic confinement of women, and the observable synchronization in the brothers' behavior. Each element demonstrated forethought and intentionality, evidence that countered the notion of accident or mere circumstance. As the trial progressed, Dr. Caldwell elaborated on psychological effects. He described the children's conditioned responses, flinching at sudden movements, freezing in the presence of authority, and exhibiting obedience beyond what would be expected from fear alone. These were the behavioral signatures of long-term indoctrination. He also noted that many of the older children, though intelligent, displayed delayed social and emotional development consistent with restricted exposure to peers and normal socialization. The environment, he stated, was designed to enforce obedience through both reward and punishment, and it succeeded to a degree that is as chilling as it is effective. Marlow presented additional evidence: the hidden graves behind the secondary cabin. Sketches, measurements, and descriptions were laid out, each mound documented in relation to its position and apparent date of interment. Prudence and Celia provided corroboration, describing the manner in which infants had been removed from the mother's care and interred secretly. The jury saw the gravity of these deaths not merely as isolated incidents, but as integral components of the doctrine. Each grave was a record of obedience enforced, a tangible testament to the family's prioritization of ideology over life. In cross-examination, the defense pressed for ambiguity, questioning the reliability of witness memory, suggesting that trauma might have distorted perception. Marlow, however, demonstrated consistency across multiple accounts: the women's narratives, the children's behaviors, the cabin structures, and the medical evidence all aligned. Even minor details, such as the synchronized nods of the brothers, the methodical cleaning of floors, and the hidden paths, pointed to deliberate orchestration rather than accident. The cross-examination highlighted not only the coherence of the evidence, but also the extraordinary extent of the family's control over both environment and people. During recess, Marlow and Caldwell reviewed the day's progress. Caldwell remarked on the precision with which the family had implemented its doctrine, noting that the intersection of geography, biology, and belief made Ravens Hollow uniquely suited for such sustained control. Marlow observed that the hollow itself seemed to persist in memory, its cliffs, laurel thickets, and hidden pathways lingering in thought as a silent participant in the proceedings. He reflected that the trial would address the actions, but the ideology, the persistent shadow of control and fear, was more enduring, more insidious. In the afternoon session, the prosecution focused on the intergenerational aspects of the Hawthornes' practices. Caldwell described not only the physical consequences but also the ideological reinforcement. Older children, indoctrinated from birth, observed the rituals and enforcement, internalizing the doctrine and perpetuating the cycle. Marlow used sketches to demonstrate the transmission of control, showing how the hollow's layout and family structure ensured oversight, obedience, and secrecy. The jury could visualize the systematic nature of the process: hidden cabins for isolation, scrubbed floors for ritual, hidden paths for surveillance, and synchronized behaviors to enforce order. Prudence testified about the methods used to maintain secrecy and control. She described the rituals of marriage within the family, the enforced isolation from outsiders, and the punishments for disobedience. "We were taught," she said quietly, "that obedience was sacred, that our bodies belonged to the doctrine, and that the hollow itself judged us. We feared the brothers, yes, but we feared the hollow more because it was everywhere, silent and patient, watching. Her words underscored the inescapable influence of environment combined with ideology. Fear, obedience, and spatial manipulation were interwoven into daily life, shaping not only behavior but belief. The prosecution also highlighted the deliberate concealment of the secondary cabin. Marlow demonstrated how the structure, rotting and obscured, had allowed the Hawthornes to confine women and children without detection. Caldwell provided additional context, emphasizing that the physical environment had facilitated the enforcement of doctrine, amplifying control through isolation, deprivation, and fear. The jury could see that the hollow itself had been co-opted into the family's system, its geography harnessed to sustain obedience and conceal atrocity. Late in the day, the defense attempted to discredit the evidence by arguing that the family had merely followed long-standing traditions, suggesting that their actions were expressions of culture rather than cruelty. Marlow countered with the precision of the evidence: scrubbed floors, hidden paths, synchronized behaviors, and documented graves. Each element illustrated intentionality, planning, and ideological enforcement, demonstrating that the family's choices had been deliberate and systematic. Caldwell reiterated the physiological and psychological consequences of these practices, emphasizing that ideology had dictated both action and outcome. As the court adjourned, Marlow and Caldwell met privately. "The doctrine is enduring," Caldwell said softly. "Even if convicted, the influence remains, carried in the surviving children and in the memory of the hollow itself." Marlow nodded. He had observed it firsthand. The hollow's cliffs, thickets, and hidden paths seemed to persist as silent witnesses, embedding the family's presence into the land. The trial would address acts and consequences, but the underlying ideology, the persistent shadow that had shaped life and death in Raven's Hollow, was an intangible that could not easily be eradicated. That evening, as Marlow walked toward the jail where the Hawthornes were held, the wind carried a chill that seemed to echo from the hollow itself. The cliffs and forests whispered with a memory of ritual, obedience, and punishment. Even miles from Raven's Hollow, its influence was palpable, a shadow that persisted in thought and perception. The sheriff understood that justice, while necessary, could only confront physical acts. The doctrine, the ideology, and the hollow's persistent presence would endure, shaping perception and memory long after the gavel fell. Inside the jail, Marjorie and her sons remained composed, their eyes steady, their demeanor unchanged. They had been informed of the evidence, the graves, the medical findings, the children's testimony. Yet they exhibited neither fear nor regret. Their ideology remained intact, their doctrine undiminished. They understood the charges but interpreted them through the lens of duty and divine mandate. Their composure was chilling, a reflection of decades of reinforcement and control, an enduring testament to the power of belief and the hollow's shaping influence. The morning of the 7th day of testimony began with a palpable tension that had settled over the courthouse like a dense fog. The trial had already consumed nearly a full week, yet the gravity of the evidence still weighed heavily on all present. The prosecution intended to delve further into the structural and ritualistic practices of the Hawthorne family, drawing connections between ideology, biology, and the deliberate manipulation of their environment. Sheriff Gideon Marlow, Dr. Alistair Caldwell, and the county's attending clerks prepared the exhibits, carefully arranging sketches, photographs, and records. Every detail mattered, every measurement had been cross-referenced, every observation meticulously documented. Dr. Caldwell took the stand first, this time addressing the systematic application of the family's doctrine in daily routines. He outlined the methods used to enforce hierarchy within the hollow rotational labor assignments, strict schedules for sleep and sustenance, and ritualized observances of obedience. The Hawthornes, he explained, were not merely acting on impulse or tradition. Their practices were codified, ritualistic, and enforced consistently. The design of the hollow itself, from the scrubbed floors to hidden pathways, was integral to this system. He presented diagrams showing the main cabin and secondary cabins side by side, connecting the layout to observed behavior. Each corridor, each loft, each cleared patch of ground was shown to have a purpose beyond mere shelter, surveillance, separation, and control. The jury examined sketches of the hollow with increasing fascination and unease. Caldwell guided them through the evidence of concealed passages and scrubbed floors, emphasizing that these were not coincidental but intentional. "Notice," he said, pointing to the diagrams, "the path leading from the secondary cabin into dense laurel. It is barely discernible, yet it allowed movement without detection. It is a conduit for control, a method to isolate individuals while maintaining oversight. Such architectural decisions, combined with enforced ritual, produced the observed physical and psychological outcomes." His words hung in the air, the weight of calculated intent making even the most seasoned observer shiver. Next, the prosecution introduced physical objects recovered from Raven's Hollow, crude restraints, worn chains, and evidence of instruments used to restrict movement. Prudence and Lillian identified several of the items, describing how they had been used to enforce obedience during daily routines and rituals. "They were not cruel for cruelty's sake," Prudence said quietly. "It was about control. Every action, every punishment, every isolation was for the purpose of maintaining the doctrine. There was no escape from its rules." The jury listened with rapt attention, the gravity of her words amplified by the evidence in front of them. Caldwell then detailed the physical repercussions of prolonged restraint, noting muscular atrophy, skeletal deformities, and developmental delays, each a direct consequence of the object's use. The defense sought to challenge the relevance of these items, arguing that objects and sketches could not prove intent or cruelty. Marlow countered by demonstrating patterns of repeated behavior, scrubbed floors, hidden paths, and the systematic placement of restraints across decades. He emphasized that the doctrine had been enforced consistently, shaping both environment and behavior. Even the most casual observer could see the intentional design in these practices, reinforcing Caldwell's clinical analysis and the testimony of the women. The court grew increasingly aware that the evidence painted not isolated acts of cruelty, but a sustained and deliberate system. Mid-morning, attention turned to the children who had survived the Hollow's strictures. Caldwell described in detail their physical examinations, highlighting anomalies in growth, neurological development, and cognitive ability. He connected these conditions to both inbreeding and enforced isolation, explaining how the environment had directly influenced development. Some children had survived extreme malnutrition, others displayed obvious signs of mental conditioning, fear responses, and learned helplessness. The doctrine did not simply control actions, Caldwell explained. It controlled development. Mind and body were shaped to perpetuate obedience, to internalize the family's ideology. The consequences are enduring. The jury noted the alignment between Caldwell's medical findings and the women's accounts of confinement. Each testimony reinforced the other, creating a multidimensional portrait of the Hollow, a controlled space, a meticulously enforced doctrine, and a series of deliberate acts of control over both life and death. Even the natural geography, the cliffs, streams, and dense forest, became implicated in the system, acting as both physical barriers and instruments of control. The Hollow had been co-opted into the family's design, its isolation and topography harnessed to perpetuate obedience. Prudence described specific rituals designed to reinforce the doctrine, including ceremonies marking births and deaths, methods of punishment, and formalized intermarriage within the family. She spoke of infants being removed, sometimes fatally, if they threatened the purity of the bloodline, and of older children enforcing the rules upon younger siblings. Lillian added that these practices were never haphazard. Every act was observed, recorded in our memories, reinforced by fear. The Hollow itself seemed to participate, watching, approving, or punishing. Her voice was calm but grave, conveying the depth of indoctrination and the relentless enforcement of ideology. During cross-examination, the defense attempted to diminish the significance of the hidden cabins, suggesting that isolation and remoteness were sufficient explanations. Marlow countered by demonstrating the precision of the family's system. Scrubbed floors, concealed paths, and synchronized behavior patterns indicated deliberation rather than coincidence. Caldwell provided medical context, emphasizing that the combination of ideology, environment, and physical restriction produced predictable physiological and psychological outcomes. The court could see the interplay between doctrine and biology, each reinforcing the other. In the afternoon, The prosecution presented evidence of communication between the brothers and matriarch Marjorie, revealing how information and behavior were monitored and enforced. Witnesses described strict hierarchies, ritualized obedience, and surveillance of daily activity, demonstrating that the doctrine had been applied consistently and intentionally. Even minor infractions were met with calculated correction, illustrating the family's unyielding commitment to their ideology. The jury observed that the Hawthornes' actions were neither impulsive nor sporadic. They were deliberate, sustained, and doctrinally mandated. Caldwell then elaborated on the multi-generational impact of these practices. He described how older children, having internalized the doctrine, would perpetuate its enforcement among younger siblings. Each generation was conditioned to enforce obedience, maintain secrecy, and uphold the ideology as sacred. The Hollow, with its hidden cabins, scrubbed floors, and isolated paths, had facilitated the perpetuation of control across decades. The system was self-sustaining, a closed environment in which ideology became law, enforced through both environment and kinship. As the day drew to a close, Marlow reflected on the broader implications of the case. Raven's Hollow had allowed ideology to manifest materially, shaping bodies, minds, and environment to sustain control. The doctrine had survived decades of isolation, enforced not only by fear and ritual but by the very geography of the Hollow itself. Even as the trial exposed acts of cruelty and murder, the underlying system, the interdependence of belief, environment, and enforcement, remained a haunting presence, resistant to eradication. Marlow and Caldwell reviewed the day's evidence late into the evening. Caldwell remarked that the medical and psychological documentation had clearly demonstrated intentionality and the multi-generational effects of the doctrine. Marlow, however, remained preoccupied with the Hollow itself, aware that the cliffs, streams, and thickets had participated silently in the family's enforcement. The trial addressed actions and consequences, but the ideology, reinforced by landscape and isolation, would persist beyond the courtroom. Inside the jail, Marjorie and her sons were informed of the day's proceedings. Their demeanor remained unshaken, their belief in the doctrine undiminished. The Hollow had shaped them, and they interpreted the charges through the lens of duty and divine mandate. Even as the evidence mounted, their composure was chilling. Decades of indoctrination had created an unassailable psychological fortress. They understood the charges, acknowledged the evidence, yet remained steadfast, their allegiance to ideology stronger than fear or shame. That night, Marlow pondered the nature of control and belief. Raven's Hollow had been more than a residence. It had been a laboratory for ideology, biology, and environment. The family had not merely survived isolation, they had weaponized it, shaping life and death according to their doctrine. He understood that the trial could prosecute acts, but it could not erase belief, nor could it dismantle the Hollow's enduring influence. In this quiet reflection, he felt a profound awareness that the Hollow's shadow would linger long after the gavel fell, and that the doctrine, though exposed, had taken root in ways that could not be entirely undone. The air in the courtroom was heavy. As the 8th day of proceedings commenced, a sense of inevitability had settled over the gallery. Journalists, townspeople, and jurors alike sensed that the trial was nearing a conclusion, yet the evidence still concealed depths that few could have anticipated. Sheriff Gideon Marlow and Dr. Alistair Caldwell prepared for testimony that would push beyond the physical and ideological framework into the chilling reality of scale, revealing just how vast the Hawthorne family's operations had become. The day opened with Marlow presenting additional documentation from Raven's Hollow. This included the full registry of births, deaths, and marriages maintained over decades, some recorded on crude parchment, others etched into wood with meticulous care. The records were fragmentary but horrifyingly detailed. Marlow emphasized the systematic nature of the family's documentation, noting how each entry reflected not only the immediate event, birth, death, or union, but the doctrinal rationale underpinning it. The registry portrayed a calculated orchestration of life, a ledger in which human beings were entries, their fates preordained and meticulously recorded. Dr. Caldwell took the stand to interpret the registry in a clinical context. These documents, he said, pointing to the pages, reveal intentional control over generational continuity. Each union, each isolation, each recorded death corresponds to observable physiological and psychological outcomes. The family's doctrine dictated genetic management, selective pairing, and strict enforcement of behavior. The physical evidence of inbreeding, malnutrition, and developmental trauma aligns precisely with the recorded interventions. It is not merely coincidence, it is science conducted under the guise of faith. The courtroom was silent as Caldwell detailed the findings. He described children born with severe skeletal deformities, malformed cranial structures, and delayed cognitive development. He explained that these anomalies were consistent not only with inbreeding, but with prolonged environmental restriction, including inadequate nutrition, enforced immobility, and isolation from peers. The surviving women confirmed the patterns, recounting how infants had been removed, relocated, or in some cases, allowed to die according to the dictates of doctrine. Every aspect of life within the hollow, Caldwell explained, had been manipulated to maintain control and preserve the sanctity of the family line. Marlow guided the jury through the physical evidence of confinement and labor. He presented sketches of the hidden secondary cabin and the overgrown paths linking it to the main homestead. Caldwell explained the psychological impact of these structures. The hollow itself had been co-opted into the system of enforcement, a natural participant in the orchestration of control. Children internalized surveillance, women internalized fear. The environment had become a mechanism for conditioning obedience. Each observation reinforced the idea that the family's doctrine was not simply abstract, but operationalized through geography, architecture, and ritualized behavior. Attention then shifted to testimony from the older children, now briefly present under court supervision. Their presence was striking. They were small, gaunt, and timid, yet their expressions revealed an acute awareness of the scrutiny they were under. One child, a boy perhaps 10 years of age, recounted in a soft, measured voice the daily schedule enforced within the hollow: wake before sunrise, perform labor, attend ritual instruction, and retire only when permitted. He described punishments for deviation, temporary isolation, deprivation of sustenance, and verbal reprimand from older siblings. Caldwell corroborated the boy's testimony, explaining the physiological and psychological effects of such routines, emphasizing that obedience had been engineered through a combination of ideology, environment, and ritualized enforcement. The prosecution then introduced photographs and sketches of the secondary cabin's interior, showing crude sleeping arrangements, confined spaces, and the small areas where children had been isolated. Prudence and Lillian described the environment, providing a visceral account of deprivation, floors scrubbed daily, food portions strictly controlled, and physical punishment administered when rules were broken. Every detail mattered, Lillian explained. From the floor to the ceiling, the hollow itself enforced the law. We could not escape it. We could not even breathe without being watched. Her words, paired with Caldwell's medical observations, created a multi-dimensional understanding of control, one that intertwined physical space, belief, and human consequence. The defense sought to question the reliability of the children's testimony, arguing that trauma might distort perception. Marlow countered with detailed observations of consistent patterns across generations, locations, and accounts. Caldwell emphasized that the alignment of medical findings, environmental control, and ritualized practice provided a robust framework supporting the children's statements. Each element, architecture, doctrine, and physical evidence, pointed toward a calculated, enduring system rather than chance or misunderstanding. By mid-morning, the scale of the Hawthornes' operations became undeniable. Marlow presented evidence of multiple hidden paths and observation points, indicating the family's capacity for surveillance and control across the hollow. Caldwell described the implications. Individuals were never truly alone. The environment itself was an instrument of discipline. The jury absorbed the full gravity of the system. What had begun as a remote, isolated homestead had evolved into a meticulously maintained apparatus of control, in which every corner of the hollow reinforced obedience, fear, and secrecy. Next, the women recounted the formalized unions and generational planning. Prudence and Lillian spoke of ceremonies officiated by Marjorie, marking intermarriage and birth control as divine mandates. They described the rationale for infant removal, the calculation behind permitted pairings, and the enforcement of ritualized behavior among children. Caldwell provided further insight into the effects of these practices. Not only did the doctrine dictate genetic outcomes, but it also perpetuated a cycle of psychological subjugation. Children learned obedience, internalized authority, and became instruments of doctrine themselves. The Hollow was both classroom and prison, shaping generations according to ideological imperatives. As the afternoon progressed, the prosecution highlighted additional consequences. The hidden graves behind the secondary cabin, meticulously recorded and aligned with births, deaths, and intergenerational planning. Sketches, measurements, and photographs were presented, showing mounds barely discernible beneath overgrowth, each containing remains of infants and children. Caldwell explained the physiological and psychological reasoning behind these actions, emphasizing that they were not acts of neglect, but intentional, doctrinally mandated interventions. The jury was shown the convergence of ideology, architecture, and human consequence, each reinforcing the other to produce a controlled, observable outcome. Marlow then presented corroborating evidence from the main cabin, detailing the methods used to monitor and enforce behavior among older children. Observations indicated synchronized movement, ritualized responses, and precise adherence to schedules. Caldwell noted that such behaviors reflected advanced psychological conditioning, producing predictable outcomes aligned with the family's doctrine. The evidence demonstrated not only the existence of control, but the efficacy of its implementation across decades. Highlighting the precision and foresight inherent in the Hawthorne's operations, the court recessed briefly before hearing closing statements on the scale of the operation. The prosecution summarized, "The Hollow had been more than a home. It was a laboratory, a classroom, and a prison. Doctrine had been operationalized through geography, architecture, ritual, and surveillance. Ideology dictated both biology and behavior, producing multi-generational consequences that could not be ignored." Marlow emphasized the deliberate, systematic nature of the practices, urging the jury to recognize that the Hawthorne's actions were not the product of circumstance, but of design. Dr. Caldwell concluded with a chilling observation: "Even as we prosecute the acts committed within Raven's Hollow, we must acknowledge the persistence of the system. The ideology remains, carried in memory, in the surviving children, and in the Hollow itself. The scale is not only physical but temporal, extending beyond this courtroom into the future, shaping perception and potential action." His words resonated, emphasizing that the Hollow was both place and force, and that its influence, cultivated over decades, could not be easily undone. By evening, the courtroom emptied with a sense of profound unease. Journalists recorded every detail, townspeople whispered about the unprecedented revelations, and jurors retired to consider the evidence. Outside, the cliffs of Raven's Hollow loomed in shadow, distant yet imposing, a reminder that the Hollow itself was an enduring presence, a silent participant in the events now scrutinized by law and society. Marlow understood, as he walked toward his quarters, that the trial had exposed acts, ideology, and consequence, but it had not, and could not, eradicate the Hollow's shadow. Inside the jail, Marjorie and her sons received word of the day's proceedings. Their composure was unbroken. The scale of the exposure, the depth of evidence, and the number of witnesses did not sway them. They interpreted the trial through the lens of doctrine. Every action taken, every child confined, every grave dug, had been an enactment of divine mandate. Even as the world outside grappled with horror, they remained steadfast, their allegiance to ideology unchanged. Raven's Hollow had shaped them, and they interpreted the exposure not as accusation, but as judgment from the outside, irrelevant to their sacred purpose. That night, Marlow returned to the courthouse to review the sketches. Testimonies once more. He traced the paths, considered the scrubbed floors, and recalled the synchronized movements of the brothers. The Hollow persisted in memory, a geography of ideology, shaping and enforcing behavior over decades. It was impossible to separate doctrine from environment, belief from consequence. He felt a deep unease, aware that while the trial addressed acts and consequences, the underlying ideology, the persistent shadow, remained. Raven's Hollow was not merely a location, it was a system, a force, and a history embedded into the landscape itself. As the sheriff closed the records for the day, He glanced out the window toward the distant hills, imagining the hidden paths, the scrubbed floors, and the shadows moving among the trees. The hollow waited, patient and eternal, its memory etched into every stone, stream, and thicket. Even if the Hawthornes were convicted, even if justice was served, the hollow's shadow would endure, shaping perception, fear, and understanding for generations to come. The system of Raven's Hollow, with all its deliberate cruelty and meticulous control, had proven enduring, and in that endurance lay a terror more profound than any single act, the persistence of ideology and the hollow itself. The courtroom was suffused with a tense, almost oppressive stillness on the 9th day of proceedings. By this point, every visitor, every reporter, every juror seemed to feel the weight of the hollow pressing against the walls, a pressure that no amount of daylight or ventilation could dissipate. Sheriff Gideon Marlow, Dr. Alistair Caldwell, and the prosecution prepared to confront the most damning evidence yet, the comprehensive scale of the Hawthorne family's operations, including the systematic perpetuation of doctrine, and the carefully orchestrated management of life, death, and obedience over generations. Marlow began by presenting a newly discovered set of documents, small notebooks that had been hidden in the rafters of the secondary cabin. Their bindings were frayed, the pages yellowed, but the writing was precise, neat, and chilling in its methodical clarity. Each notebook contained detailed observations of daily routines, punishments, unions, births, and deaths, meticulously logged over decades. Caldwell explained that these were more than mere diaries. They were operational manuals, recording the family's methods for maintaining control and ensuring the purity of the bloodline. Every note, every measurement, every annotation was a reflection of deliberate intent. The prosecution then called upon Prudence and Lillian to read aloud passages from the notebooks. Their voices were steady, though the content made their eyes glisten with memory. The passages described infants removed from mothers, small children confined to lofts for days without food, and older children compelled to enforce obedience upon younger siblings. They recounted in grim detail the ceremonies marking marriages between close kin and the rationale behind each union, a meticulous attempt to preserve genetic purity, sanctioned by the matriarch and justified as divine mandate. The jury listened, enraptured and horrified, as the methodical cruelty of the system emerged with startling clarity. Dr. Caldwell then took the stand to contextualize these observations. The Hawthorne family, he said, operated as both priests and scientists, observers and participants. Their system ensured the continuity of doctrine and the controlled manipulation of human development. Their meticulous records allowed them to track outcomes, adjust practices, and maintain predictability. The entire environment, architecture, geography, daily routines, was exploited as an instrument of conditioning. The hollow itself became a laboratory and the family its researchers. He paused, allowing the jury to absorb the weight of his words. What is particularly disturbing is that these practices were sustained across generations, with children You're to internalize, enforce, and perpetuate the same ideology that produced their own suffering. Attention then shifted to the hidden graves surrounding the secondary cabin. Marlow presented detailed sketches and measurements, demonstrating the careful planning of each mound. Caldwell explained that these were not accidental or haphazard burials. They reflected a deliberate system of recording, preserving, and controlling the memory of death within the hollow. The graves were positioned with awareness of sightlines, proximity to dwellings, and alignment with ritual spaces. Each burial reflected a calculated decision, balancing ideology, discipline, and secrecy. Jurors were shown photographs, close-ups of small skeletal remains partially exposed by erosion, and the meticulous placement of markers etched into the ground. The scale of loss was staggering. The prosecution called for testimony from the surviving children, now older and under careful supervision. Their presence was a stark reminder of both resilience and the enduring reach of doctrine. One girl, perhaps 12, described the system of observation in the main cabin. She and her siblings were never left unmonitored, their every action measured, every deviation corrected. Another boy, slightly older, recounted the rhythm of labor and ritual, the synchronization of tasks, and the enforced memorization of doctrine. Their voices, calm but precise, conveyed the depth of indoctrination and the meticulous control that had defined life within the hollow. Dr. Caldwell elaborated further, detailing the physiological and psychological consequences of the system. He explained that confinement, limited nutrition, ritualized punishment, and intergenerational inbreeding had produced predictable outcomes: stunted growth, cognitive delays, fear conditioning, and physical deformities. Caldwell emphasized that these were not incidental effects, but anticipated and monitored results. The system had been designed with the precision of an experiment, replicated over decades, with careful attention to outcomes and adjustments based on observed consequences. The jury could not ignore that this was not a case of eccentricity or neglect. It was deliberate, calculated, and sustained. By late morning, the prosecution shifted to the structural and environmental components of the hollow itself. Marlow guided the jury through diagrams showing the alignment of cabins, lofts, hidden pathways, and observation points. He explained how scrubbed floors, concealed passageways, and synchronized behavior all functioned as instruments of control. Caldwell noted that the geography, topography, and dense vegetation had been leveraged as tools for surveillance and isolation. The hollow was not merely a backdrop for abuse. It was an active participant in the enforcement of doctrine, a silent but omnipresent force shaping the lives of all who lived within it. Prudence and Lillian then recounted the final, most unsettling aspect of the system, the perpetuation of ideology through ritualized instruction. Children were trained to internalize the doctrine, repeat the mandated prayers and commands, and enforce rules upon younger siblings. Caldwell explained that this created a self-sustaining cycle. Indoctrinated children became enforcers, ensuring that the system remained intact across generations. The psychological impact was profound. Children were taught to view obedience as sacred, compliance as moral, and deviation as sinful. The family's ideology had been instilled so deeply that survival within the hollow depended on internalizing and perpetuating it. The prosecution concluded the morning session by summarizing the evidence of scale. Marlow emphasized that the Hawthorne family had constructed not merely a home, but a system, multi-generational, meticulously documented, physically enforced, and psychologically internalized. Caldwell reinforced the point, noting that the combination of doctrine, environment, and behavior modification represented a level of systematic control rare in human history. The jury was left with a chilling awareness. This was not a localized or isolated series of acts, but an expansive, enduring network of control and manipulation that spanned decades. After lunch, attention turned to the court's final witness, Sheriff Gideon Marlow himself, who recounted his initial exploration of Raven's Hollow. He described the synchronized movement of the brothers, the scrubbed floors, and the hidden paths. He recalled the small children glimpsed at the loft edges, the malnourished women, and the emaciated faces of the surviving offspring. He spoke of the oppressive silence, the weight of observation, and the realization that the hollow itself had been weaponized to sustain the doctrine. Marlow's testimony was measured, yet the intensity of his recollection conveyed the profound impact of witnessing the system firsthand. Marlow's account culminated in a description of the final discovery behind the secondary cabin, the graves of infants and children carefully positioned, documented and hidden. He emphasized the alignment between records, ritual, and outcome, noting the deliberate orchestration of life and death. Caldwell corroborated the analysis, explaining that the pattern was consistent with both the doctrine and the medical evidence. The jury was presented with a full view of scale. The system, not the individual acts, defined the Hawthorne family's control, and the depth of planning and execution left no doubt as to intent. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom was silent with contemplation. The evidence of scale was undeniable, and its implications were suffocating. The prosecution had demonstrated that the Hawthornes had orchestrated life, death, and behavior with precision and purpose. The hollow itself, shaped by geography and isolation, had been incorporated into the system, acting as both tool and enforcer. Doctrine, biology, environment, and observation had combined to create a multi-generational mechanism of control, one that persisted in memory, behavior, and consequence. That night, Sheriff Marlow returned to Raven's Hollow with Dr. Caldwell to review the hidden paths and structural features. Even under the dim light of lanterns, the scrubbed floors, overgrown paths, and silent cabins radiated a sense of control and presence. They traced the roots, observed the sight lines, and measured the spaces where children had been confined. The hollow's geography, Caldwell noted, had reinforced ideology. Cliffs, streams, and dense vegetation functioned as instruments of surveillance and isolation. Marlow felt a cold understanding settle in his chest. The hollow itself was complicit, an enduring participant in the system. As they left, the sheriff could not shake the sense that Raven's Hollow's reach extended beyond the walls, beyond the forest, beyond the court. The ideology, the meticulous planning, and the environmental reinforcement would persist long after the trial, echoing through memory, family, and landscape. Even as justice moved forward, the hollow remained, patient, silent, and eternal, its shadow cast over the mountains, shaping fear, understanding, and the perception of control for generations to come. The spring of 1919 brought the trial to its conclusion, yet no sense of closure permeated the town, the courthouse, or the surrounding ridges of Raven's Hollow. The proceedings had exposed horrors that strained comprehension: multi-generational confinement, ritualized unions, systemic abuse, and the meticulous orchestration of life, death, and ideology. Jurors, reporters, and townspeople alike emerged from the courtroom haunted not only by the details of what had occurred, but by the undeniable sense that the hollow itself had enforced these acts. The verdicts were delivered in a solemn, almost ceremonial manner. The Hawthorne brothers, Alaric, Benedict, and Corwin, were found guilty on count TS of incest, unlawful confinement, and contributing to the deaths of children. Marjorie Hawthorne, the matriarch, was convicted of complicity, indoctrination, and aiding and abetting unlawful confinement. The sentences were severe, decades in the state penitentiary, though the law could not undo the damage already done. The surviving women and children were placed under protective supervision, moved to the county seat under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Marlow and Dr. Caldwell. Even as justice was enacted, a profound unease lingered. The shadow of the hollow, and of its meticulously maintained ideology, seemed impossible to erase. The survivors' transition from Raven's Hollow to the town was a slow, painstaking process. Prudence, Lillian, and the older children struggled to reconcile freedom with the conditioning that had governed their lives. For decades, the Hollow had instilled obedience, fear, and ritualized behavior. Dr. Caldwell worked tirelessly to provide care and rehabilitation, offering structured schedules, nutritional support, and psychological counseling. Yet even in the comparatively bustling environment of the county seat, the weight of the Hollow's influence persisted. Children instinctively observed sight lines, maintained synchronized movement, and measured their actions against invisible rules they had learned to internalize. Caldwell remarked in his reports that this degree of ingrained conditioning was extraordinary, a testament to the deliberate and systemic methods employed within Raven's Hollow. Sheriff Marlow took a personal interest in the survivors' welfare. He arranged for accommodations, educational support, and discreet protection from public curiosity. Yet even he was unsettled by the enduring presence of the hollow in memory and behavior. He recounted noticing small, almost imperceptible gestures among the children: a glance toward a window, a pause at a threshold, a coordinated step, all remnants of years spent under strict observation and control. The hollow, he realized, was not merely a location, it had become a system, a persistent force that shaped perception, decision-making, and the very sense of self. Meanwhile, the Hawthorne brothers and Marjorie were transferred to the state penitentiary under strict security. Reports from guards noted their composure, an eerie calm that seemed almost impervious to the confines of a conventional prison. They spoke rarely, answered questions in measured tones, and maintained the same synchronized mannerisms observed during the initial investigation. It was as though the hollow itself had accompanied them, a silent presence guiding thought, behavior, and interaction. Psychologists consulted by the state remarked on the rarity of such enduring behavioral patterns, particularly given the trauma, conviction, and incarceration involved. The brothers' adherence to doctrine and ritual appeared unbroken, a living echo of the hollow's influence. Back in the mountains, Raven's Hollow remained untouched, isolated, and unclaimed. Sheriff Marlow and Dr. Caldwell visited the site after the conclusion of the trial, inspecting cabins, hidden paths, scrubbed floors, and remnants of graves. They observed the same oppressive silence, the same sense of watchfulness, as if the hollow itself was aware of their presence. Trees had grown over many paths, concealing the intricate network of observation points and hidden routes. Yet subtle traces persisted, scrubbed patches of earth, aligned stones marking graves, and remnants of structures that spoke of precise placement and design. The hollow, even in the absence of its former inhabitants, retained an aura of control, a physical manifestation of ideology and discipline. Local residents reported lingering unease in the months following the trial. Hunters who ventured near the cliffs noted unnatural stillness, sudden silences, and fleeting shadows glimpsed among the trees. Travelers claimed the hollow seemed larger, its ridge is higher, its streams colder and swifter than memory suggested. Some swore they heard whispered commands carried on the wind, voices recalling lessons of obedience, fear, and ritual. Even those with no direct connection to the Hawthornes felt the hollow's presence as an intangible weight, an inherited dread that permeated the mountains themselves. For the survivors, the psychological journey continued. Prudence and Lillian worked to nurture the children, fostering trust, autonomy, and awareness outside the hollow's ideology. Yet the persistence of early conditioning presented daily challenges. Children reacted instinctively to perceived observation, hesitated when unmonitored, and experienced difficulty distinguishing autonomy from ritualized obedience. Dr. Caldwell's reports documented gradual progress, noting that while physical freedom was immediate, psychological liberation was far slower, requiring years of structured intervention and consistent care. He emphasized that the hollow's influence was not only physical or environmental, but encoded into behavior, cognition, and emotional response. The legal system grappled with the unprecedented nature of the case. Scholars of law, psychology, and anthropology studied the trial as a benchmark for understanding multi-generational control, ideological conditioning, and the impact of isolation on human behavior. Publications in academic journals noted the unique convergence of geography, doctrine, and human psychology, emphasizing that Raven's Hollow had functioned as both prison and laboratory, home and system, environment and pedagogy. The case became a reference for understanding extreme forms of social and behavioral control, though the horrors themselves were seldom repeated in contemporary society. As the years passed, Sheriff Marlow retired from active duty, yet he remained attentive to the hollow and its survivors. He maintained correspondence with Dr. Caldwell, tracking the children's development and the ongoing rehabilitation of the women. Marlow often reflected on the hollow's lessons, particularly the subtle ways geography, ideology, and observation can converge to shape behavior. He understood that while law could prosecute acts and ideology, it could not instantly erase the environmental and psychological systems that had produced decades of suffering. Raven's Hollow, he realized, had become more than a location. It had become a cautionary emblem, a symbol of persistent influence that defied conventional intervention. In the town, the memory of the trial faded slowly. Newspapers chronicled the convictions, but most accounts avoided detailed discussion of the hollow itself, leaving its geography, hidden paths, and internal system largely to legend. Locals, however, retained the stories in hushed tones, passing them along as warnings. Children were told never to venture near the cliffs, hunters avoided the hollow, and families whispered of a place where doctrine, environment, and observation combined to create a machinery of control. Though decades would pass, Raven's Hollow remained a locus of fear, a landscape in which memory, history, and human behavior intersected with enduring consequence. The surviving children, now adolescents, occasionally whispered among themselves about the hollow, recalling specific events, rules, and punishments. Though removed from the physical space, the hollow persisted in memory and in the internalized systems of control. Dr. Caldwell observed these behaviors with both fascination and concern. The ideology had not been eradicated, only displaced into cognition and habit. The hollow's influence, he noted, was portable, persisting wherever the survivors carried their memories, fears, and conditioned behaviors. One evening, years later, Marlow visited the edge of Raven's Hollow alone. The cliffs loomed as they had for decades, the hollow below shrouded in shadow and silence. The stream gurgled faintly, the trees whispered in the wind. and the paths once carefully maintained now lay hidden beneath moss and undergrowth. Yet as Marlow gazed into the valley, he felt the hollow's persistent presence. It was as though the place itself remembered, as though every scrubbed floor, every hidden path, and every synchronized gesture of the past continued to exist as an imprint, a force beyond human intervention. He turned to leave, but a faint whisper seemed to brush across his ear, carrying words he could not fully discern, a warning, a reminder, a lingering command. The hollow endured. The aftermath of Raven's Hollow was not merely legal or social, it was psychological, cultural, and ecological. The mountains carried the echoes of doctrine and control, the valleys whispered of obedience and fear, and the hollow remained a persistent, almost sentient reminder of the consequences of isolation and ideology. Though the Hawthornes were imprisoned and the surviving women and children had been removed, the system they had created endured in memory, in behavior, and in the land itself. Even today, when the wind cuts sharply across the ridges, or when the stream gurgles beneath shadowed trees, the hollow's presence lingers. Travelers report an uncanny sense of being observed, a weight on the chest, and a faint whisper among the laurels and rhododendrons. The law, society, and medicine may contain the remnants of Raven's Hollow, but they cannot erase the imprint left upon the mountains, the survivors, or the collective memory of those who witnessed its influence. The hollow remains, a system, a place, and a warning, enduring across time. The names that haunted the hollow, that defined its doctrine and maintained its ideology, remain etched in memory. Elias Hawthorne, Benedict Hawthorne, Corwin Hawthorne, Marjorie Hawthorne, Prudence, Lillian, and the surviving children, each a living testament to the meticulous, terrifying system of Raven's Hollow.